Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to today's episode of the Law of Self-Defense. I am, of course, attorney Andrew Branca for the Law of Self-Defense. Thank you. Thank you very much. And today we are here to talk about a segment that Tucker Carlson of Fox News did earlier this week or last week, depending on how you look at it. I think he did it on Thursday as part of his normal, very popular evening program in which he's talking about self-defense and the application of self-defense law to selected cases that he decided to use to highlight his segment. I had a chance to look at that segment this morning, and it was about as quality as one would expect from mainstream media on anything to do with self-defense. Now, I preface my comments here by saying that generally speaking, I'm a fan of Tucker Carlson. I like his work. I think he's funny. I think he produces an entertaining and politically savvy product for consumption by the public. And of course, it must be said that he's in his role as a pundit when he's doing this segment, not as an attorney. I don't know if Tucker Carlson is trained as an attorney or not. I really don't know anything about his background. And this should not be perceived as a hit piece on Tucker Carlson. It's not intended that way. It's merely intended to correct what I perceive as misinformation, mischaracterization, and misunderstanding of self-defense law that could mislead the general public who watches this stuff. So we're going to do a brief show today as kind of a response video to Tucker. Now, if you'd like questions answered at any time during the show, I just threw the shirt and tie on right now for just ran over to do this quick knockoff show right now. Whether or not I'm actually wearing pants is a different question. But as always, if you'd care to pose questions and get them answered by me during the show, there's two ways to do that. One of them is to, if you're watching this on YouTube live, you can do a super chat on YouTube, a minimum of $5, and I'll answer your questions on YouTube. By far, the more cost-effective way to pose questions to me is as a Law of Self-Defense member. Then you get all your questions answered for no more than the monthly membership fee, which is less than $10 a month. So instead of $5 per question, $10, less than $10 a month gets all your questions answered. And you can become a Law of Self-Defense member right now. Open up another tab in your browser, go to lawofselfdefense.com/join, and you'll get all the instructions you need to get. You need to access the Law of Self-Defense dashboard, watch this live stream on the member dashboard, and pose your questions in the chat. For those of you who are Law of Self-Defense members and are watching this on that dashboard, as always, I ask that you please put your questions or preface your questions with the word questions in all capital letters, so it's easy for me to pick out of the general chatter. Let me make sure we're streaming everywhere we're supposed to be streaming, and it looks like we are. Let's see, but maybe everywhere. Let me refresh this. And we are, even on Twitter. So, again, generally I'm a fan of Tucker Carlson. Tucker, don't take offense, but I call him as I see him, and I have to correct misstatements of self-defense law where I see them, regardless of whether they come from people I like or people I dislike. Finally, before we jump into the substantive content for the show, I do, of course, have to mention today's sponsor, which is none other than Law of Self-Defense itself. Our Law of Self-Defense advanced course. This is our full-day course on self-defense law. It makes you hard to convict if you're ever compelled to use force in defense of yourself, your family, your property. The only one of these classes scheduled for all of 2023 is Saturday, April 15th. And if you sign up for that class during the month of February, you get 25% off the normal registration. I know there will be people in the comments who've taken this class before. It's extremely popular. People like it. It's the only place I'm aware of where you can get a genuine, competent instruction of practical, actionable self-defense law in a single day. You can learn more about all that, including seeing the more than 100 self-defense law questions we address in the course of that advanced class, and register for the class at lawofselfdefense.com/advanced. Okay, so let's pull up Tucker. There we go. So Tucker opines on a number of things in this segment. He speaks of self-defense politically as a right, and I certainly agree with him from that perspective. He trips up when he gets to the practical application of self-defense as a legal privilege for the use of force on other people. The privilege of self-defense does not make us all 007 agents, 00 agents, I guess, who have a license to kill whenever we feel like it. There are specific conditions and circumstances that must be met in order to be privileged to use especially deadly force on another person. And your decisions in the use of deadly force in defense of a person must be based on evidence, not speculation, not imagination. Now, generally speaking, of course, the conditions for the use of force in self-defense are these 5 elements of self-defense. These are the building blocks of any claim of self-defense in any state in the country. They are innocence, imminence, proportionality, avoidance, and reasonableness. By the way, you can get this little cheat sheet for free. We provide it for free. It lists the 5 elements of self-defense, provides a brief description of each. You can get this at lawofselfdefense.com/elements. It's just a PDF download. We don't charge a penny for it. So what do these 5 elements mean? Innocence, imminence, proportionality, avoidance, and reasonableness. Now, first of all, I'll point out that not all 5 elements are always required. It's the maximum of 5, which is good. There's not 500 elements to worry about. There's not 50 elements to worry about. There's only up to 5. But there are jurisdictions and circumstances in which one or more of those elements might be legally waived and not required. For example, avoidance. The element of avoidance has to do with whether or not there's a legal duty to retreat before you can use force in self-defense. About 40 states are stand your ground states in America, so they don't impose a legal duty to retreat before you can defend yourself. So in otherwise lawful cases of self-defense, the element of avoidance is not required. However, many of the elements of those 5 elements are required. However, they are cumulative, meaning all the required elements are required, obviously. Another way of looking at that is each of them is a target of attack for a prosecutor who wants to attack your claim of self-defense as a justification for your use of force on that other person. And if he can defeat any one of the required elements of self-defense, your claim of self-defense, your privilege of self-defense doesn't get diminished. It gets obliterated. It's gone. You have no legal justification, which is a problem in a self-defense case because inherent to claiming self-defense is conceding that it was you who used force against the other person. Self-defense is a legal defense of confession and avoidance. You confess to the underlying conduct and then sorry. And then you seek to avoid legal liability for that use of force through the privilege of self-defense, the legal defense of self-defense. Sorry about that, folks. For some reason, my iPhone has started playing YouTube videos by itself, unprompted. I don't know why that is. Never happened before, but there we go. So confession and avoidance. So if the avoidance part, if self-defense is attacked by the prosecutor successfully and goes away, what's left of confession and avoidance if avoidance is not there anymore? Just confession. So it's a walk away, easy conviction for the prosecutor. So when we're looking at a claim of self-defense, we need to see evidence to support each of the required elements of that claim of self-defense, whether it's all 5 elements or 4 elements or however may be required. They need to be based on actual evidence, not speculation, not imagination. It's not self-defense, legally speaking. You may feel like it is emotionally, but as a legal defense, it's not self-defense if one of the required elements is missing or there's no evidence to support it. It's also important to keep in mind that these decisions on whether to charge someone who used force against another person have both a legal and a political component. Now, we focus here on the legal components, the legal merits of a claim of self-defense or the vulnerability to attack of a claim of self-defense from a legal perspective. There's also political components that come into play. So a prosecutor may have a legally meritorious attack on a claim of self-defense and choose not to pursue that attack, choose not to charge that person. Or they may feel that a person has a reasonably strong claim of self-defense, but nevertheless choose to put it to the test in a trial for political reasons. And unfortunately, our prosecutor class has become hyper-politicized in recent years, particularly George Soros-funded candidates who are elected to their prosecutorial positions explicitly for political purposes, which is not great. But you have to separate those two analyses. The political analysis and the legal analysis are two different things. I think someone's running a Harley outside my office window here. That's too bad. All right. So with that out of the way, I'm going to start this video. Almost certainly Fox News is going to complain to YouTube that I'm using copyrighted material. This is fair use of copyrighted material, folks. In fact, I have the usual disclaimer. I may as well read it aloud, I suppose. This video is for educational purposes only. Copyright disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act of 1976. Allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. Fair use is a use permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Nonprofit, educational, or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use. So this is for purposes of criticism, commentary, and education, folks. Clearly within the bounds of fair use. And none of you are paying, required to pay for access to this content. It's streaming for free on YouTube, on Rumble, on Twitter, and so forth. All right, so let's get to Tucker here, and I'll be pausing throughout. So this is going to take longer than what the 14 minutes or so that Tucker's talking about here. But as I have things to say, I'll certainly pop up and say them.
Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. Here's a story that tells you a lot. Last Friday, a 35-year-old convicted felon called Austin Simon walked into a neighborhood convenience store in Harlem in New York City and pushed his way behind the counter. Austin's girlfriend had just had a...
That is the wrong video, darn it. That's not the video I wanted. That's not the video from this week. Let's see. Okay, sorry about that. That's from 7 months ago. Let me see if I can find the new one. Of course, now the first thing that pops up is, let's see. Yes, here it is. All right.
Good evening and welcome to Tucker.
Now I have it. Now I have it. Okay. This is from 1 day ago. It says...
Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. It used to be, before liberals embraced authoritarianism, that they would talk a lot about rights. Your right, my right. Everything was a right to health care, Miranda rights. You can debate whether those are rights or not. But if you're talking about rights, you at some point want to identify the most basic human right of all. What is that? Well, of course, it's the right of self-defense. That's the essential right upon which all other rights depend.
Well, I would certainly agree. In fact, I think it's even more foundational than most of what we recognize as civil rights, because it's a natural right. It's a right of nature. Even animals protect themselves from attack. It's part of living. So it's arguably the most fundamental right that we have, the right to be alive in the first place. The other rights become rather moot if you don't have the right to survive an attack.
If you can't defend yourself, you can't defend your family and your property, you don't have any rights at all.
So you do have a right, of course, to defend yourself, your family, and your property. But that right comes, that legal right comes with conditions that must be met. Conditions in terms of when you're allowed to use force, conditions in terms of how much force you're allowed to use, conditions of how long you can continue to use that force. In fact, I neglected earlier to step through the other elements. I provided a brief definition of one of these 5 elements, avoidance, but there's 4 others: innocence, imminence, proportionality, and reasonableness. So we may as well talk about them. Innocence has to do with the requirement that you are the non-aggressor. You are the victim of an unlawful attack. If you're the initial aggressor in the confrontation, you can't claim self-defense for your initial aggression. if there is no attack upon you or immediately about to occur. Immediately about to occur comes to the element of imminence. Imminence is the condition, the requirement that you're defending yourself against an attack that's either in progress or immediately about to occur. You don't have to wait to get shot or wait to get stabbed, but you have to be defending against a threat that's immediately about to occur if it's not already in progress. It can't be a speculative future threat. Well, he might do this. He might do that. He might come back tomorrow. He might go retrieve a weapon. That's all speculative unless you have actual evidence to support that. And it can't be a past threat that's over. That's just retribution. That's not defending against an imminent threat. Then we have proportionality. Generally speaking, if you're only facing a non-deadly force threat, your proportional response would be non-deadly defensive force, not going to the gun to defend against a non-deadly threat. Generally speaking, you can only use deadly force in self-defense if you're facing a deadly force threat. And finally, reasonableness has to do with the requirement that you have a genuine good faith belief in the need to use force in self-defense, and that that belief is also objectively reasonable, meaning both that it's not an irrational belief on your part. A hypothetical, reasonable, and prudent person would share that subjective belief in the need to use force, and it's reasonable. It's based on the application of the powers of reason to actual evidence. It's not merely speculative.
You're a slave by definition. So you may be wondering, in this moment of creeping authoritarianism, how is the right to self-defense doing in our country? We could give some kind of long lecture, but instead, how about some examples? Consider 2 shootings that took place at gas stations in the past year in the United States. The first shooting occurred around 2 p.m. on October 6th in the state of Missouri. A 23-year-old felon called Javon Taylor, who had a long criminal record, convictions for armed robbery, for example, began threatening a female clerk, apparently because the gas station didn't carry the kind of cigars that he wanted. That's when an off-duty fireman called Anthony Santi, who was inside, decided to step in. He told Javon Taylor to leave the store. Well, in response to that, Taylor began threatening him and then ran toward his SUV outside. Santi followed him outside because he suspected that Javon Taylor would retrieve a gun from the car, and that's exactly what he did. Javon Taylor pulled an illegal handgun with an extended magazine from his SUV. Santi, not wanting to get shot, put Taylor in a headlock. And that's when Javon Taylor handed the gun to his girlfriend, and his girlfriend shot the unarmed fireman in the back, killing him.
Okay, so there's a lot of... I covered this case closely, and it's a terrible case, of course. Certainly, I wish the fireman was not dead. I think there's a lot of factual misrepresentations or exaggerations going on here. It's based on the facts I saw at the time I did my analysis shortly after this event. The felon in the store was not threatening the clerk. He was speaking rudely to the clerk when the fireman decided to step in to stop the rude talking to the clerk. That's not an excuse for the felon to go out to his vehicle and get a gun, which of course is what he did. And frankly, if the felon had come back with a gun, the fireman had seen that and had drawn his own pistol and shot the felon, it would almost certainly have been lawful self-defense. Indeed, putting the felon in a headlock so the felon could not shoot the fireman would be a lawful use of force in self-defense. Even choking the felon out to unconsciousness, so long as you stopped the choke once the felon was unconscious, would be a lawful use of force in self-defense. But that's not the right legal question here. The right legal question is not, was the firefighter justified in his force on the felon? Almost certainly he was. The question is, was the girlfriend justified? Now, Tucker characterizes this as the felon in the chokehold handing the gun off to the girlfriend so that it would be obvious that that transfer was taking place. Those aren't the facts as I saw them or heard them at the time. The facts as I heard them is that the girlfriend was sitting in the vehicle, didn't see the confrontation, came out when she heard a ruckus, and just saw the fireman choking the felon, her boyfriend, and a gun nearby. Now, did she know it was her boyfriend's gun? Probably. Let's assume that she did. She picks up the gun and she's begging the fireman to let him go. Stop choking him. He can't breathe. Is that true that he couldn't breathe? I don't know. Does a fireman have a good reason not to release the felon? Yeah. I mean, if he releases the felon, maybe the felon simply retrieves the gun and shoots the fireman. I get it. But again, we're not judging the fireman's conduct. We're judging the woman's conduct. And here the woman is likely to argue to the authorities that as far as she could tell, as far as she knew, what she was perceiving was someone attacking her boyfriend, choking him to death without apparent justification, because she didn't see the whole start. She's only knowing what she's seeing in the moment. And although she repeatedly asked the fireman to stop choking her boyfriend to death, he continued to choke the boyfriend to death. And so she shot the fireman to protect her boyfriend. Is that consistent with the facts as we know them, or at least as they were presented at the time? Yes. Now that's the legal merits of the question. Of course, the burden then would be on the prosecution to disprove her narrative of self-defense beyond a reasonable doubt. That's the burden on self-defense. Maybe the prosecutor genuinely believes they don't have a reasonable prospect of doing that. So the prosecutor could well think, I'm pretty sure there's a good chance this wasn't legit self-defense, that she knew exactly what was going on. But how do I prove that to a jury beyond a reasonable doubt? So I don't think I have good prospects for getting a conviction, for defeating her claim of it would not be self-defense, it would be defense of others, but the elements are the same. Also, as Tucker will go on to note, apparently the local prosecutor is politically oriented. This is Missouri. This is the land of Ferguson. Michael Brown, hands up, don't shoot, all that. So maybe the prosecutor would be disinclined to bring charges, even if there were legal merit to attacking this claim of defense of others. I don't know. But it doesn't help to mischaracterize the facts of the case.
It was an execution. It's not a close call. The footage is online. We're not going to show it to you because it's awful. But if you have any doubt, you can watch it.
I've watched it.
There's no debate about what happened here.
There is a debate.
And yet the local social justice DA, Jean Peters Baker, refused to press charges against the person who killed the firefighter. Now, why? Well, there may have been a political component. And we know that because online, BLM activists immediately celebrated the killing on racial grounds. Javon Taylor was black, Anthony Santee was white. That was enough for them.
Okay, so BLM activists may have celebrated it or not. I don't know. That has nothing to do with the legal merits of the use of force. Whether or not someone celebrates after the fact has nothing to do with the legal merits of the actual use of force event. Two completely separate things.
They're glad he's dead. Now consider the second gas station shooting. This one happened just before midnight, less than a month ago in Austin, Texas. An armed man with a long criminal record called Marquise Demps walked into a Shell station and became violent.
So the long criminal record thing, Tucker likes talking about this. But legally, unless the defender was aware of the long criminal record, it could not have played a role in his decision-making in self-defense. You're not allowed to just imagine someone has a long criminal record. If you don't know in the moment that they do, how would it possibly play a role in your decision-making in self-defense? It almost certainly would not be admissible at trial against that person you defended yourself against.
Here's a report from the local Fox station describing what happened next.
Customers who frequent the family-owned Shell gas station on East MLK in Springdale can't say enough good things about 25-year-old employee Yassine Naz.
Okay, I'm not going to attempt to pronounce his name, but let's purport. This is the owner or worker inside this convenience store. A thankless job. I've done that job, folks. Got robbed all the time. So I know what it's like to be in that position. Nice guy, never been in trouble with the law before. Okay, let's purport that.
They're stunned to hear Naz is charged with first-degree murder after police say he shot and killed 42-year-old Marquise Demps outside the store late Saturday night.
Okay, first red flag. So the news story tells us this gentleman came in and was violent. Well, if someone's violent towards you, that may meet the conditions to justify your use of deadly force in self-defense. But the first red flag is that this killing happened outside the store. So now I have to begin to wonder, well, if the shooting had happened inside the store, okay, that feels like could be self-defense. How did it get outside the store?
According to court documents, Demps came into the store and caused a verbal disturbance that turned physical.
All right, a verbal disturbance is verbal threats are alone, absent physical threats, verbal threats alone are never enough to justify the use of deadly force in self-defense. So that by itself wouldn't be enough, but apparently things escalated to violence.
That there was some type of altercation happening inside the store, and that's what started everything.
Demps waving a knife at the workers, so Naz grabbed a gun.
Okay, waving a knife at people, and the defender grabs a gun. Could that be justified? Sure, right? A knife is a deadly weapon. The question with a knife, because a knife is an impact weapon, is whether the circumstances of the waving of the knife were such that the knife presented an imminent, that's one of the elements here, an imminent threat of death, meaning the infliction of death or serious bodily harm either was already in progress, being stabbed, or immediately about to occur. With an impact weapon like a knife, there are circumstances in which someone waving a knife is an imminent threat and circumstances in which they're not. If they're just standing beside you, threatening you with the knife in their hand, they can clearly immediately bring that knife to bear to inflict death or serious bodily injury. But if they're 100 yards away waving a knife, they're not yet an imminent threat. If they're on the other side of a pane of security glass with a knife, they're not an imminent threat. They can't immediately bring that weapon to bear to cause death or serious bodily injury. The same with if there was an obstacle, if there was a shelf of produce between the man with the knife and the purported victim, can't stab through a shelf of produce with a knife. So we would need to know more details. Maybe we have an imminent threat of deadly force here. Maybe we don't. We need more facts.
Telling him to leave. Instead, Demps began trashing the store. Naz's father showing us the damaged merchandise and display cases, the credit card machine ripped out of the counter.
Okay, so the trashing in the store, that's no fun, right? The store owner has to clean that up. There'll be damages. There'll be, property will be lost because it's broken or whatever the case may be. In these kinds of stores, the prospect that insurance would cover the loss, especially if it's an owned establishment, probably low. So nobody likes that, right? That's property damage. But are you allowed to shoot someone over property damage? Well, not in Missouri and not in 48 other states. There is one state that allows you to use deadly force in defense of mere personal property, which is what we're talking about here. But even in Texas, there's a lot of conditions. And in any case, this is not in Texas. This is in Missouri. So the trashing in the store, while an escalation, is not a threat of force against another person that would justify the use of defensive force.
Demps left. Naz followed him into the...
Uh-oh. So Demps, the quote-unquote bad guy here, leaves the store. And he's pursued by the defender out into the parking lot. And the quote-unquote bad guy here gets into his car, and then the purported defender shoots him dead as he's sitting in his car. Oh, was it Texas? Oh, the previous case was Missouri. The fireman case was Missouri. All right, so maybe he would have had a defensive property scenario there inside the store while the property is being threatened. Fair enough. But he follows the guy out of the store to the car.
Parking lot and shot him multiple times through his car window.
So
what's the justification for shooting him through the car window? Well, we'll hear a reason that Tucker will recount. I'm not sure if Tucker's more accurate with this fact than he was in the fireman fact.
a guy with a criminal record and a knife in his hand starts trashing your store and then runs outside to his car. You see, Naz told police later that he shot Marquis Demps because he feared for his life. He thought the guy was going to get a gun and come back and kill him.
Okay. Did he have evidence? Did he have a reason to believe Demps was going to retrieve a gun from his car and come back and kill him? Now, if Demps retrieved a gun from his car and came back to kill him, he'd have a clear justification for the use of deadly defensive force. But is he just speculating? Because you can't shoot someone over speculation. Now, if Demps said, I'm going in my car to get a gun, if Demps was known to the shooter to be someone who habitually carried a gun in his car, maybe you could make an argument there. But you can't base it on speculation. And you can't do what Tucker's going to say here is that, well, it happened in a different case, the fireman case in Missouri, where there the felon went to his car and got a gun. Therefore, you can assume it's going to happen here too. No. That's not the way the law works. The law doesn't allow you to assume or speculate that someone's going to threaten you with deadly force and therefore allow you to shoot them. You have to have a reasoned belief not a speculative belief, a reason, evidence against which you're applying your powers of reason to come to a reasoned conclusion.
And that's a reasonable fear, of course.
It's not a reasonable fear. It's a speculative fear. A reasonable fear is based on evidence to which you're applying your powers of reason, not just imagination or speculation.
The Anthony Santis murder demonstrates that it is. But in this case, the DA, a Soros-funded anti-police political activist called Jose Garza, is pressing charges against the clerk.
So it's a big problem, folks. The moment you start pursuing the other party, it begins to not look like self-defense anymore. If you're going to the fight rather than the fight coming to you, it doesn't look like self-defense anymore to anybody. Now, as I said earlier, there's a legal merit analysis that we focus on here. There's also the political decision-making. That is not our focus because we have no control over that. There's no boundaries to that. There's no structure to that. Prosecutors have infinite discretion on whether or not they want to charge or not charge. And we know from experience, if we have Soros-funded prosecutors, we get a certain type of decision-making out of those people, politically motivated decision-making, because they were put in their jobs for political purposes. But however they're making their political decisions has nothing to do with the underlying legal merit of the claim of self-defense. And if you pursue someone out of your store and shoot them through their car window and cannot point to an imminent threat in the moment, the guy had a gun, I had good reason to believe he was retrieving the gun, that's not going to look like self-defense to anybody. And you ought not be surprised when you get charged with murder or, at best, manslaughter.
He wants you seen as a man who is widely respected in his community, a man who actually contributes to our society, as you just heard. He's trying to send that man to prison for the rest of his life.
And by the way, we may wish that we lived in a world where if you're a convenience store owner and someone comes in and trashes your place of business, that you are allowed to shoot them. I get it. I've worked that convenience store job. You're stuck in that community. Generally, this guy Demps here is not all that unusual in that community. In my experience, my convenience store was also in the equivalent of Martin Luther King Boulevard. And so reputation means a lot. And if people know they can just come in and trash your store, you may end up getting more people coming in to trash your store when you catch them trying to steal or you catch them doing something wrong. Happens all the time. So just like shopkeepers have a shopkeeper's privilege to detain a shoplifter for the police, which is not a privilege we normally have, unless if we're not a shopkeeper. For us, it would have to qualify as a citizen's arrest. It might be unlawful detention, unlawful imprisonment, it might be kidnapping. But a shopkeeper generally has a shopkeeper's privilege to detain someone they have good reason to believe was a shoplifter for authorities. So there are ways we give shopkeepers like this convenience store worker legal privileges that most of us wouldn't have. And maybe they ought to have a legal privilege to use deadly force in defense of the property of their establishment. But that's not the world we live in. Now, again, under Texas law, Texas does have a provision for the use of deadly defensive force in defense of property. Maybe the shopkeeper's story narrative will change once he's spoken with counsel, hopefully competent counsel, and it will turn out that he had good reason to believe that Demps was escaping with stolen property. Then he could apply Texas Penal Code 9.42, deadly force in defense of property, and he may have a legal justification. But he better get his story straight pretty quick.
So, but these two cases together, consider them in tandem. What's the message? Well, the message is if a violent felon starts terrorizing people in your store, ripping your store apart on which you rely for your livelihood, you can't do anything.
Well, you can do things. You can use non-deadly force in defense of your property. You just can't follow him out to the parking lot and shoot him dead in his car.
If he goes back to his car to get a gun, you have to let it happen.
By the way, if you'd like to see Texas Penal Code 9.42, that's Texas's unique, it's the only state that allows for this unique statute for the use of deadly force in defense of personal property. You can just open up another tab and point your browser to lawofselfdefense.com/942. That'll pull up the statute for you. And folks, I see a bunch of questions in the comments. Some of you rolled in late. I explained it at the beginning. If you want your questions answered and you're watching on YouTube, It needs to be in the form of a $5 super chat, $5 minimum. Or if you're a law self-defense member, just put your question in the chat, preface it with the word question in all caps, and I'll answer that at no cost. And that's a more cost-effective way of getting me to answer your questions, folks, because you can be a law self-defense member for less than $10 for a month. I think it's $9.95 for the month, and you get all your questions throughout the month answered at no additional cost other than your normal membership. Or it's $5 per question on YouTube. So if you'd like to take the more cost-effective route, you can point your browser to lawofselfdefense.com/join and become a law self-defense member instantly, right now, for less than $10 a month, about 30 cents a day.
So get shot or go to jail for the rest of your life. Those are your choices.
No, those are not your choices. First of all, this clerk was not being threatened with getting shot anyway. It was a knife purportedly in the other gentleman's hand. But he could have just stayed in the store and let the other person drive away. Now, that may be unpalatable, but it is a choice that's an alternative to get shot or go to jail for the rest of your life. So this is an unfortunate misrepresentation by Tucker.
Of course, are not really choices at all. And these are not isolated cases that we cherry pick to make some polemical point.
Yeah, and if you are watching this on YouTube, if you could hit the subscribe button, that's appreciated. I think I'm getting pretty close to 50,000 subscribers. And the thumbs up button is also great. And if you drop a comment in, even if it's just your city and state, that helps fool the algorithm into sharing our content more broadly. That would be appreciated too.
It's happening everywhere. We saw it happen to Jose Alba last summer in New York. He's the bodega clerk. The prosecutor sent to Rikers Island on a murder charge because he fought back when a thug, another convicted felon, attacked him with his girlfriend in the store. Now, that charge was ultimately dropped after the public flipped out because it was so unfair. But Alba left this country for the Dominican Republic because he saw where things are going. Self-defense, the cornerstone of all freedoms, without which you can't.
By the way, I did an in-depth analysis of this case as well back at the time. So you can find that probably in my YouTube history. This was about 7 months ago, this event. Or if you're a law self-defense member, it'll be in our blog.
Cannot be free. You are owned. Self-defense is becoming illegal, in effect, in a lot of places. And
well, it's not illegal anywhere. In fact, self-defense law in America is about mostly the same. It's about 80% the same across the 50 states. The biggest variance is that legal duty of that element of avoidance, whether or not there's a legal duty to retreat. About 40 states don't impose that element. About 10 states do. But otherwise, the black letter law self-defense is pretty consistent across the U.S. Where you get big variances is not in the legal merits of the use of force. It's in the political decision-making of the prosecutors of whether they want to compel a defender to justify that use of force in court, which greatly increases the cost and risk of exercising your right of self-defense, obviously, if you're brought into trial. There's plenty of cases in which the prospects for overcoming self-defense at trial are almost zero. George Zimmerman, Kyle Rittenhouse, and they're brought to trial anyway for purely political purposes at great cost and damage to the defender. Those are unjust prosecutions in self-defense cases. So that certainly is unfortunate. And sadly, the only real fix we have for that is to elect different prosecutors or put into effect something like my own proposed Kyle's law, which would hold prosecutors personally financially responsible for the defendant's legal fees if they failed to generate at trial even 51% of evidence against self-defense. When they need to overcome self-defense for legal purposes, they need 90%, 95% evidence against self-defense. I've proposed that if the jury is told, hey, if you acquit this defendant on the basis of self-defense, meaning the state failed to disprove self-defense by the required 90%. And you believe not only didn't the state have 90%, they didn't even have 50%, that prosecutor should be at least partially, personally responsible for that defendant's legal expenses. Because the prosecutor knows he's got to disprove self-defense by 90% going into the trial. If knowing that when he gets the trial, he can't even disprove it by 50% by a preponderance of the evidence, that's an unjust prosecution on its face.
Not just in very liberal places like New York City, even in states with some of the strongest self-defense laws on the books. Arizona, for example, allows residents to shoot trespassers on their property.
Okay, no, Texas does not allow you to shoot trespassers on your property. Again, Texas does have that Texas Penal Code 9.42. You can find it at lawofselfdefense.com/942. The only state in the country that allows for the use of deadly force in defense of personal property. But it has a list of enumerated crimes. In fact, why don't I just pull it up? We can take a look at it. We can look at it together. Okay, Texas Penal Code 9.42. A person is justified in using deadly force against another to protect land. That would be open land, like undeveloped land. There's different laws for defense of your home, for example. So we treat undeveloped land differently than a land that has been improved with structures and homes and such. But here we're just talking about unapproved land or tangible movable property. That's personal property. And Texas is the only state that allows for the use of deadly force to protect tangible, movable property. In the other 49 states, you have no privilege to use deadly force in defense of personal property in the absence of a threat to persons. And if there's a threat to persons, it's a self-defense, defense of others case. It's not a defense of property case. But you're justified in using deadly force to protect personal property. First, the first condition, there's lots of hoops that have to be jumped through here. If you would be justified in using force, meaning non-deadly force, under 9.41, which is the Texas statute for non-deadly force in defense of property. So before you're privileged to use deadly force in defense of property, you have to meet all the conditions for non-deadly force in defense of property. And then the additional requirements are when and to the degree you reasonably believe the deadly force is immediately necessary to prevent the other's commission of, and there's a set of enumerated crimes here: arson, burglary, robbery, aggravated robbery, theft during the nighttime, or criminal mischief during the nighttime. Is simple trespass listed there? No, it's not, folks. So you cannot use deadly force under Texas law for simple trespass, simply to kill a trespasser. Now, if the trespasser is threatening you or someone else with deadly force harm or otherwise triggers some independent privilege for you to use deadly force, sure, then you can use deadly force, but not based on the simple trespass. That's not the case.
So 73-year-old George Allen Kelly lived right on the border. Now, you may have heard that Joe Biden opened the border to millions and millions of people from other countries whose identities we don't know to just walk in. So you probably all heard about this case. I know people have been pinging me about it relentlessly for the last 24 hours or so. This rancher who apparently shot an illegal immigrant on his property and has now been criminally charged. Looks like a very sad situation. But the fact that Joe Biden is reprehensibly allowing our southern border to be flooded with illegal aliens, letting all these people into the United States, does not change the legal privilege for the use of force. Self-defense law, defense of others law, defense of property law doesn't automatically, magically change because we have Biden as our president who's not enforcing our southern border. The rules don't change. You live on the border, this has changed your life completely, and it scared you. So George Allen Kelly was one of those people, lives on the border. He's seeing this firsthand. Now he is in jail tonight, charged with first-degree murder because he shot an illegal alien who trespassed onto his ranch in Keno Springs.
Are you allowed to use deadly force against a simple trespass? No. No. So there needs to be more here than simple trespass for this killing to be justified.
2 miles from the border. This happened January 30th, just the other day. Now,
someone walking into your home, a home is highly defensible property, has many more protections than a simple trespasser on open land. There's no evidence that this illegal immigrant was shot inside this guy's home.
Know the details of the altercation between the man in prison and the man he killed. But the man in prison has no record of killing anyone else. He's not a convicted felon. He does not have a violent history.
But that doesn't mean that his killing of this man was lawful. The fact that he hasn't murdered someone before doesn't mean this was justified self-defense under the law.
The man he killed was an illegal migrant called Gabriel Cuen Butima, and he was deported several times from the United States, but let back in. We're not attacking him, just noting him. That's true. So George Allen Kelly apparently felt threatened and shot that illegal migrant.
He apparently felt threatened, but this is speculation. There's no facts here. He's not saying the migrant threatened him with a knife or had a gun or was trying to break into his house or into his vehicle. We're just supposing that he was threatened, because we wouldn't kill someone unless we were threatened. But people do things all the time that are unlawful, whether they know they're unlawful or not, when a reasonable path would have been different.
But prosecutors did not give him the benefit of the doubt. They instantly charged him with first-degree murder. So here he is, George Allen Kelly. This is the guy who, according to Arizona...
Well, if you kill someone and you can't provide a reasonable explanation for why you did that, you ought not be surprised when you're charged with first-degree murder. It's unlawful to kill people without legal justification.
Authorities is a dangerous risk to public safety who must spend the rest of his life in prison. Assess, does he seem dangerous to you?
He doesn't need to seem dangerous to me. I'm not contemplating using force against him. But if you kill someone without justification, it's an unlawful killing. It's murder or, at best, manslaughter.
Notice coming in, Your Honor, my wife is present in the court. May I ask her to make an appointment for an audio-visual conference, and I've not been able to talk to her or anyone?
So that's something that has to be discussed with the detention facility downstairs. So that conversation would have to be had with them, sir. Okay. So if your wife wants to have communication with you, she can go to the sheriff's office and they can go ahead and make the proper accommodation that they need to make.
I appreciate you giving that instruction.
So certainly the person, he doesn't seem very threatening there, does he? Does that mean that his shooting of the illegal immigrant was lawful, was justified? No, it doesn't. And now Tucker's going to make a big deal about apparently this quote unquote judge who was just providing that guidance to this gentleman is not an attorney.
This is an elderly man who can barely walk, who has never been convicted of a violent crime. And he's being treated like a child by some disembodied voice from some fascist. That's what you just saw. Now, the judge in this case is called Emilio Velasquez. Now, who's Emilio Velasquez? He's a judge. He doesn't even have a law degree. He's not a lawyer, and yet he's a judge. He's an elected politician.
So, in fairness, I don't know who this Velasquez is, but this could well be an arraignment. An arraignment is where you're informed of what the charges are against you. You make initial plea, always not guilty, of course. There may be arrangements for bail, whether you'll remain in custody. But usually those are done by what I would call a magistrate, not a full-blown judge. A full-blown judge presides over felony trials, for example. You don't need a full-blown judge to do an arraignment because the process is so straightforward and so simple. There's no complicated decision-making happening. And arraignments are happening hundreds, sometimes thousands a day in large jurisdictions. So you don't want to staff all of that with full-blown judges, qualified judges, people qualified to handle weeks-long felony trials. You just need a magistrate. You need kind of a junior judge to handle those arraignments. And there's no reason for a magistrate that he has to be a lawyer. It's a very simple job. So it may be that this video is simply from an arraignment where there's a magistrate involved. And then it could well be an elected position. It's like any other, town or county type of position. Really, anybody can do it. It's not complicated.
And he is allowing the prosecution of an American citizen who exercised his rights under Arizona law and his most basic human right, which is if someone comes onto your property and you feel threatened by it, you have a right to defend yourself by force.
No, that's not true. So your perception that you're being threatened has to be reasonable. It can't be arbitrary, speculative, or irrational. What was your reasonable belief that you were being threatened?
Period. But Velasquez does not acknowledge that right. And so he set the bail for this elderly man whose wife is living alone in their home right near the border at $1 million. So news of this case obviously traveled past Arizona, and people were justly outraged by what is being done to this man. So people tried to raise money to pay that bail on GoFundMe. But GoFundMe wouldn't allow that.
Well, of course, GoFundMe is a political leftist organization. But that's a political decision. That's not a legal merits decision.
This elderly man rotting in jail while his wife lives alone on a border that the Democratic Party has kept open. You can't raise money for his bail. They shut down, GoFundMe shut down the effort to raise bail for this guy. Now, of course, you can raise money for BLM as they burn our country down to make sure Donald Trump is not reelected.
And that's fine political commentary. I get it. I'm not a fan of BLM. I probably share Tucker's perception of BLM, but that's got nothing to do with the legal merits of this guy's shooting of that illegal alien.
But you're not allowed to raise money for people who are being held on $1 million bail on first-degree murder charges for defending their own property along an open border. True insanity and a danger to all of us. Even in Texas, which in some places is still a free state, self-defense is slowly becoming illegal. A few weeks ago, a thug walked into a taco shop holding what looked to be a gun, scared the hell out of everybody inside and stole their money. He pointed this gun, turned out to be fake, at several customers. How would you feel if you were there in the restaurant and some lunatic with a gun starts shoving the barrel in people's faces and stealing their money? Well, one brave man stood up and eliminated the threat. Here it is.
A man wearing a mask and gloves inside the taqueria around 11:30 Thursday night, pointing what looks like a gun at customers while demanding money. As some hide and throw cash, this man takes action just as the robber heads to the door, still.
So we covered this case in great detail when it happened. You can find it on our YouTube channel or for Law of Self-Defense members on our blog. 3 sets of shots here. First 4 shots, second 4 shots, and then a 9th shot. The first 4 shots were absolutely legally justified. The second 4, sketchier, but probably legally justified. That 9th shot was an execution shot into the head of this robber when the robber had been stripped of his only apparent weapon by the shooter and then what appeared to be unconscious on the floor, unmoving. And he got a 9th shot into the head. It's that 9th shot that's the problem here.
With his gun drawn.
Picked up the money, turned around and left, and that's when the customer got up and shot him.
The shooter angry, realizing the robber's gun is plastic.
That's irrelevant, of course. If it appears to be a real gun, you're allowed to defend against it as if it were a real gun.
Returning the stolen money to customers, taking a sip of his drink, and leaving before police arrive.
So it'd be interesting, and we should do this, play that video for the entire country. And let's have a national referendum on what ought to happen to the man who shot the armed robber. You're eating with your family in a restaurant. Some lunatic in a mask comes in and shoves a gun in your face, which you think is a gun, and steals your money. And somebody stands up and shoots him back. What percentage of Americans think that guy should go to jail?
He shouldn't go to jail for shooting him while he was facing an imminent threat. That execution shot is a problem.
Right around 0, probably. But Houston police, along with the county district attorney, are putting that man in front of a grand jury to send him to prison. They're saying he shot the criminal one too many times. Okay. It's not hard to see why people are making sure they're putting down violent thugs. If they don't, they'll get out of jail and start terrorizing more people. That is happening everywhere. It just happened in Tupelo, Mississippi in September. Mississippi is a state controlled by Republicans. But politicians in Mississippi started letting felons out on parole, and that would include a man called Chris Copeland, who's 26. He had multiple convictions for burglary and auto theft. Copeland, while out on probation, executed a clerk inside a Chevron after robbing him. He made that clerk, a man called Parmveer Singh, sit down and then shot him in the back of the head. This footage is awful, but it's real. Turn away if you don't want to see it. Here it is.
Yeah, man, you take it all, no problem. Promise. Oh. You take this one. No, you take. Beautiful.
just executed him. So
Yeah, so obviously no one's defending that. That's a bad thing.
politicians can feel like good and virtuous people by giving a second chance to felons. And by the way, felons do deserve a second chance. Not everyone in prison deserves to be there. But when you let people out wholesale and then don't keep track of them, just expect the best, you're going to let psychopaths like Chris Copeland into the general population, and they're going to execute store clerks, who are the last people who deserve to be executed. They're working for like $8 an hour to sell you lotto tickets. Meanwhile, people who defend themselves against criminals get the maximum possible sentence. The government gets to defend itself with bodyguards. Politicians have tons of bodyguards you pay for. Congress is so afraid of the people they govern, they built a wall around the Capitol this week. But you can't fight back. And we began to see this accelerate in 2020 during the BLM riots. So a BLM mob broke the gate into Mark and Patricia McCloskey's property in St. Louis. They were having dinner. All of a sudden, the mob shows up. And so in response, they did what you would do if you were awake. You grab your firearms. You don't shoot anybody. Back off. Those firearms were lawfully owned. They were on their property, as was the mob. Here's what it looked like.
As you might imagine, I covered this case in great detail when it occurred as well. Personally, folks, I would not have, absent apparent efforts to breach my home, I would not have been outside the home with guns. I would have been armed inside the home. I mean, I'm always armed inside the home. I just carry a gun for personal protection. It doesn't go away just because I'm inside my house. But outside you're not doing yourselves any favors. You're not in a more defensible position. I'm not saying what they're doing here is unlawful. I'm saying it's not tactically prudent.
Remember that? They were racist, right? A group of highly entitled children of orthodontists showed up on their property to threaten them, and they said, back off. So they're racist, said the Washington Post. And then, of course, a Soros-backed prosecutor called Kim Gardner charged the McCloskeys with crime, not the mob.
Well, she's a thoroughgoing shitbag, and that's why she was taken off this case.
The McCloskeys for daring to defend themselves. Their guns were seized. Now, the point of this, of course, is not to make anybody safer, just the opposite. And St. Louis has not become safer. It's become much more dangerous. Under Kim Gardner, the city has experienced its highest murder rate in decades. So public safety is not the point. The point is disarming you so you can't defend yourself against their plans for you. Now, thankfully, Mark McCloskey and his wife were pardoned these outrageous charges by the governor of the state, thank God. Subscribe to the Fox News YouTube channel to catch our nightly open.
So that's it. That's the video I wanted to comment on for all of you. Let me take a quick look and see what we have for questions. Again, folks, I'm largely a fan of Tucker Carlson. I have to confess, I don't really watch TV. So that includes, I don't watch Fox News either. They're on TV. Tucker's show is on TV. So I very rarely see it. What I do see of it, I generally view favorably from a political perspective. This, of course, falls within my particular area of expertise, use of force law, and I saw a lot of probably not deliberate misrepresentations. It's very common. Normal people don't really understand actual use of force law. That appears to include Tucker Carlson, so I thought I would correct the errors here. Let's see. Yes, a lot of members were wondering if I would comment on this. Someone's asking if I should inquire into being a guest on Tucker's show. Folks, I've been on these shows. Now, I've never been on Tucker's, but I've been on similar shows. Megyn Kelly, other people, too many to even remember. The format is not conducive to what I do, which is actual legal analysis commentary. You generally have 3 or 4 minutes to comment. The host takes half the available time asking questions, generally proposing like facts that are mistaken. So first you have to correct the facts before you can even get to how the law would apply. And just when you're beginning to get some traction, it's time for another guest, or there's another guest on with you at the same time so that your share of the time gets cut even more, or they go to commercial or to a video, and also, it doesn't hurt to say, but they don't allow you to plug your products and services. So it doesn't really raise any revenue for me. So about half the time, more than half the time these days, I'd say 75% of the time when I'm asked to go on one of these shows, I either decline outright or I recommend another attorney, someone who may have an interest in being on the show, to do it. But I don't have much interest. A longer form show where you have 30 minutes, an hour to talk through these cases, yeah, that would be great. I'm happy to do that. I do that all the time. But these high profile television short segment type shows just aren't very helpful to me. Let's see. Question: did you see the Stumpy Stabber in Huntington, California use of force event? That can't be a real name. Pop up. Oh, the double amputee with the knife. The police shot him, I guess, right? Yeah, so when I first heard that presented, reported in the media, they were saying the police shot a guy with no legs in a wheelchair just because he had a knife in his hand. It turned out he was actually dangerous, demonstrably dangerous with a knife, because he just stabbed someone already. That's why. So, yeah, I may cover it. Maybe I'll do it tomorrow. It doesn't look nearly as interesting as initially did. Let's see. Robert asked, question: with respect to defense of others, wouldn't the defender be put in the shoes of the original aggressor? And that's a great question. So there's self-defense, right? The required elements of a claim is self-defense. And then there's defense of others, which really shares the same elements. One big difference, though, is when you're defending yourself, you have your own perceptions of what's happening and how things got started. You know, for example, if you were the initial aggressor in the fight. If you turn a corner and you come upon a fight of other people and you decide to intervene on someone's behalf, you don't have the same own impressions of everything, of how the fight started. You don't know how the fight started. The fight was already in progress when you turned the corner. And the legal standard for those cases used to be that it was called the alter ego standard. If you intervene on someone's behalf, you basically stepped into that person's shoes, and your limit to use force on their behalf was no greater than if they were arguing self-defense themselves. Well, what that means is if you turn the corner, you see a fight in progress, you come to the defense of who you think is the victim. And later on, it turns out that victim was actually the initial aggressor. They were just losing the fight in the moment you turned the corner. Well, if they were actually the initial aggressor, they have no privilege of self-defense. They've lost that element of innocence. And under the alter ego standard, if they would have had no privilege of self-defense, you have no privilege of defense of others on their behalf. The modern standard, however, really in every state today, is much more of a reasonable person standard. So you're not bound absolutely by the legal privilege of the person you defended. You're allowed to rely on your reasonable perception of what's happening. You can be wrong in your perception and still have a legally sound defense of others justification for your use of force. Mistakes are allowed in self-defense. Mistakes are allowed in defense of others. They need to be reasonable mistakes. Like Tucker was talking about the shooting in the taqueria, where it turned out the armed robber's gun was not real. So when he was shot, he was not actually a deadly force threat to the people in the taqueria. He didn't have a real gun. So they were mistaken. They believed he had a real gun. They believed he was a deadly force threat. That's why they shot him. And they were wrong. That wasn't true. But that mistake is permissible because it was a reasonable mistake. It looked like a real gun. A reasonable person under the circumstances would have perceived it as a real gun. So you're allowed to make mistakes and still be legally justified in using even deadly defensive force so long as your mistake is reasonable. And that's the standard that's applied to defense of others now. Now, you do have a problem if you turn a corner and intervene in a fight. You don't know how it started, because if you don't have a factual basis to come to a conclusion, a reasoned conclusion on who is entitled to be defended here, how could your perception be reasonable? There's no facts. You don't know how it started. You weren't there. So that is a risk that you have with defense of others that you don't have with self-defense typically. Let's see. Yeah, more questions about being a guest on Tucker's show. I do really like Tucker. I guess if he asked me, I would go just so I could say I'd done it. But again, those appearances tend not to be very productive for me. And Law Self-Defense member Johnny says, I was on a podcast as a guest before I saw your breakdown on the Houston taqueria, and I gave the same basic analysis. Yes, anyone who's informed on the actual law should give the same basic analysis. It's not really rocket science. You need to know. Gutfeld. Yes, I'm a big fan of Gutfeld. Years ago, I used to watch a lot more TV, and The Five was one of my go-to programs for sure. And I was aware Gutfeld had a late night show, but I generally don't stay up late at night, so I rarely saw that. He's very funny. I like him a lot. I guess if he asked me on, I would go too, just to say I did it. Again, maybe the late night show, because it seems, my impression is it's kind of longer format than the daytime show. And by the way, I'm not criticizing these people for having short format shows. They know how to run I don't run a TV show on Fox in the daytime. Maybe that's what you need to get clicks and advertising and viewers. And, they're clearly highly successful at what they do. It's just not a format that's conducive to what I do. All right, let me take a look at the super chats, if there are any. Oh, gosh, there's a bunch. Okay. Bunglebush, $5. Thank you very much. Says, I was a huge Tucker fan until he started using the death of a young lady in a plane crash as proof that food plants are being attacked in a conspiracy. I don't know anything about that. Poofy, $2 super chat, but Poofy didn't pose a question. So thank you for the $2. I appreciate it. Brian Schultz, $20. Wow, thank you so much. Boyfriend is a felon in possession of a firearm. He came out to the car to get a gun and go back in the store. She had to have, 1, known he was a felon, and 2, seeing that he was not in any danger when he retrieved the gun. Well, both of those things could be true, right? But you can't, the fireman doesn't get to kill him because he's a felon. That's not a reason to kill somebody. And that he was not in any danger when he retrieved the gun, that's not when she defended him. When she defended him, when she shot the fireman, she was watching the fireman choke him. That's when she made the decision to use defensive force. And folks, I'm not saying she's right. I mean, I don't know what was going on in her head. We very rarely know in any absolute sense whether a shooting was genuinely, in an absolute sense, legally justified or not. We just have to build legal arguments about them and make a determination of whether, to a reasonable degree of legal certainty, it seems likely that a prosecutor could disprove self-defense beyond a reasonable doubt. And that might be tough here, especially with, not that it should matter, but the white guy choking a black guy in a parking lot. I mean, the whole nation's been propagandized with George Floyd, with Ahmaud Arbery, it makes it a tough sell to a jury. Let's see, Sassy Frask, $10. Thank you so much. Is there a law regarding what can be used to what is a reasonably established, clearly an identified threat to defend yourself? Can one use anything to defend themselves? I'm not sure I understand the question, but I'll take a shot at it. I think what you're asking is there a law about the precise tool or mechanism of self-defense that you're using? And the answer is not for use of force law purposes. Now, we have lots of weapons law in America, but I distinguish between weapons law, gun law, what guns you're allowed to have, what magazine capacity, what length knife, whether the knife can be double-edged or not, whether it can be assisted opening or not. Very, very complicated and highly varied weapons law across the United States. But weapons law is different than use of force law. Weapons law is what kind of weapon are you allowed to have in your possession, for example. Use of force law is when are you allowed to use a certain force in defense of yourself, others, or property. And how use of force deals with the amount of force you're using is the element of proportionality right there. And basically, it just puts force into one of two buckets, non-deadly force and deadly force. And that's all it cares about in terms of proportionality. If you're attacked with only non-deadly force, you should use only non-deadly force in self-defense. If you're attacked with deadly force and the other conditions for self-defense have been met, you can use deadly force in self-defense. But the law doesn't really care about the particular mechanism of deadly force that you're using or that you're threatened with. It just cares whether or not the force is likely to cause death or serious bodily injury. If you're being threatened with force X that's likely to cause death or serious bodily injury, you're being threatened with deadly force. And if the other conditions of self-defense are also met, you can use deadly force in self-defense. And the law doesn't really care about the nature of the deadly force precisely. So the law doesn't, for example, the law doesn't say that a shotgun blast to the head, clearly deadly force, is more deadly force than a baseball bat to the head. They're both force likely to cause death or serious bodily injury. They're both deadly force. There's no legal distinction between the two for use of force law purposes. So if you're privileged to use deadly force against another person, you've met all the conditions. The law doesn't really care if you're using a gun or a knife or a bat or your car or a piano dropped from a great height. It doesn't make any difference. Now, for weapons law purposes, it could make a big difference. For example, you're using a gun. You're not supposed to have a gun. You're a felon, right? You use the gun in self-defense. Your act of self-defense could be perfectly lawful, but you could still be found guilty of a gun charge. Two different things. Chris Harris, $10. Thank you so much. Writes, I live in Austin, Texas, and have already been attacked and luckily didn't have to use deadly force while carrying. Would wearing concealed body armor be harder to defend when the prosecutor says it's acting like a cop? So people always ask me, can a prosecutor use this against me in court? X against me in court? And the answer to that is always yes. If by use this against me in court, we mean, can a prosecutor talk about it in front of a jury to try to make me look bad? Prosecutor can talk about anything in front of the jury. Will it have weight? Is it a meaningful, substantive threat against your claim of self-defense? Well, it depends on what it is. I've seen prosecutors yell and scream to a jury about the fact that the defender had a round in the chamber in the ready-to-fire position. Well, if you're carrying a gun for personal protection, of course it has a round in the chamber. Every bailiff in that courtroom had a round in the chamber. It's normal. But the prosecutor was still allowed to talk about it in an effort to make the defendant look malicious. Did it work? No, that defendant got acquitted. But the prosecutor was allowed to try. What I generally tell people is look as boring as possible. Carry boring guns, carry boring ammunition, conduct yourself in a very boring way, not a hothead, to make the prosecutor's job harder. Don't hand him the evidence he needs to persuade a jury that you should be convicted. So weird guns, weird calibers, weird knives, weird things, anything you do that's weird gives the prosecutor another hook he can use in his narrative of guilt with the jury. What about body armor? Well, again, we kind of have the weapons law thing. I think in some jurisdictions, body armor is not lawful. So that would be an independent crime by itself. I think in many jurisdictions, body crime used in the process of committing another crime is definitely illegal. So if you get convicted on the use of force event, it would be an aggravating charge to also be convicted for the body armor. So you want to be cautious about that. Same with guns, of course. You use a gun in self-defense. If you get convicted, if self-defense fails, you get convicted of the use of force, right? The killing, murder, manslaughter, whatever, aggravated battery, and then the gun sentencing enhancement on top of that. So something to think about. Now, listen, if you feel you need to wear body armor, you got to win the fight. If you're not alive, the legal stuff doesn't matter. So I'm not telling you not to do it if it's lawful in your jurisdiction to do it, but it's not common. It's not normal behavior. So I would want to be able to articulate why I was behaving in an unusual way. Are you in a situation, do you close a bar late at night? Are you known to carry valuables as part of your business that makes you an unusually high probability of being a robbery victim? Are there crimes in your community, stabbings and shootings that you're aware of and have documented beforehand even if that's just saving them on a tab in your browser, that raises your concern about violence on your person. And that led to you getting the body armor. I would want to document all that ahead of time. So if the prosecutor does try to use the body armor against you, and he almost certainly would, that you have a way to counter that argument from the prosecutor. Oh, very kind. Look at this. Michael Cipriano, $10 super chat. Can you wish us luck? We are representing someone and going to a self-defense immunity hearing on Wednesday. Your analysis and book have helped our firm out immensely. Thanks for doing what you do. That's very kind, Michael. I wish you had emailed me about this. It would have been interesting to know more about the case. Keep me informed if you're watching this still. I'd like to know how things work out. If it's going to be televised, or like on YouTube, I would definitely follow it for sure in real time. But that's very kind of you to say. I'm glad my work was helpful to your client, and certainly, I wish you and your client the very best of luck. I'm a big fan of these self-defense immunity hearings. Sassy Frass, $20. Thank you so much. The Constitution of the United States, Article 4, Section 4. The United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government and shall protect each of them against invasion. Yeah, but I don't do invasion law, folks. That's a political problem. This country allowed Biden to be made president. Fair Frozen 55, $5. Says, no, Tucker, self-defense should not be subject to the whims of the masses. God, is he even listening to what he's saying? Again, Tucker does a show, right? He doesn't do what I do. He doesn't do legal analysis and commentary and use of force law. He's doing a show. He's got 10 minutes to make this point he wants to make in the segment, or 15 minutes, whatever it is. I get it. It's a different job than what I have. And certainly Tucker Carlson is far more successful in his commentary job, at least based in terms of revenue, money, compensation, I would imagine, than I am as a small town attorney in Colorado. So full credit to him. But those were not accurate representations of the facts of many of those cases or the law as it's actually applied. All right, I'll take, let's see, one more look. Northman, law self-defense member Northman says, I use the facts regarding your review of the 5 officers and the resisting subject. This would be the Chicago arrest of the subject that died. You'd have thought that I was the Antichrist for suggesting that maybe we needed more facts before destroying these men. Yeah, well, welcome to the party, pal. I get that all the time. Let's see. Miles Dog, law self-defense member. Question, I got here late, maybe tomorrow. Comment on the Denver DA charging the cop for 2 felony charges. He had a dangerous backdrop while stopping a lethal threat in front of a bar. Yeah, so I haven't covered these charges. I did cover that shooting when it happened. So a bunch of cops, uniformed cops, responded to a man with a gun on a sidewalk call outside of a very crowded sidewalk out in front of a bar. I think the bar was closing. People were flowing out into the sidewalk. In any case, it was very crowded. And as the cops kind of swarmed in on foot, they had their guns out already because they were going to a man waving a gun around call. And sure enough, there was a dude with a gun. And the dude he tosses the gun, but the cops open fire regardless. Now, of course, the cops could have had a reasonable perception that the gun coming up in the hands of the suspect was about to be shot at them. But in what happens when you have a bunch of cops responding, you end up with a bunch of cops shooting. So a lot of shots were fired by the police, and several bystanders were shot. I'm not sure any of them were killed, but several were shot in the course of this fire. And now at least one of them has been charged with a couple of felonies. It's a bad outcome case, folks, right? We don't want innocent bystanders shot. It's unfortunate. I suspect the cop had a reasonable basis on which to discharge his weapon. If he had good intent, justification for shooting at the suspect, then that good intent, that justification follows his rounds. And the shootings, if he fired in a non-negligent manner, because sometimes under stress, sometimes you miss, sometimes bullets overpenetrate. It's not automatically negligent or reckless just because a bystander got hit. If he fired in a non-negligent manner and was otherwise justified, then the fact that the bystanders were hit is not a cause of criminal liability for that officer. It's just not. And that's the argument his counsel will have to make. Let's see. Law Self-Defense member Joe DiMartino says, comment, Gutfeld's late night show is a freewheeling panel format talk show more conducive to conversation and education than detailed analysis of a particular use of force incident. I guess if he flew me into New York, I'd probably go. Let's see. All right, I think I circled back. Let me refresh the super chats one last time to make sure I'm not missing anybody. And it looks like I'm not. All right, folks, at this point, I will go ahead and wrap things up and try to do other things with my Saturday afternoon. Thank you all so much for joining me. Don't forget, Saturday, April 15th is our only Law Self-Defense Advanced course scheduled for this year. This is a full-day class taught live by me, Zoom to you at your computer. It teaches you how to be hard to convict, to be an unattractive target for prosecution if you're ever compelled to use force in defense of yourself, your family, or your property. This is the only Law Self-Defense Advanced class scheduled for 2023. It's on Saturday, April 15th. Join us then. Learn more about this class and save 25% on your registrations if you sign up in the month of February at lawofselfdefense.com/advanced. All right, folks, thank you so much. I'm not sure what I'm doing tomorrow. Maybe I'll do a show, but Monday I expect to be back on the Alec Murdaugh murder trial as the guest of Nick Wakita. I'll send out, of course, emails about all of that as it happens. Until then, remember, if you carry a gun so you're hard to kill, that's why I carry a gun, so I'm hard to kill. My family is hard to kill. Then you also owe it to yourself and your family to make sure you know the law so you're hard to convict as well. Until next time, I remain Attorney Andrew Branca for Law Self-Defense. Stay safe.